Ya está en el aire Juan Manuel Cao. A fondo.
Bueno, muy bien. Hoy empezamos con la entrevista completa a Mar Polimeropoulos, que fue jefe de operaciones clandestinas de la CIA para Europa y también para Asia, que fue víctima directa del síndrome de La Habana. Como vimos el viernes pasado, cuestiona directamente el informe de la comunidad de inteligencia, que ha llegado a la conclusión de que detrás de los eventos no se encuentra ningún adversario extranjero o un arma. Polimeropoulos ha conversado ampliamente con el periodista Miguel Cosío, gerente general de AméricaTeVé Network, y debido a la importancia de sus declaraciones creemos necesario publicarlas en toda su extensión. Así que muy buenas noches a todos ustedes, bienvenidos a Fondo. Muy bien, nos acompaña Miguel Cosío, gerente general de AméricaTeVé Network, que fue quien conversó directamente con este testigo de sección. Así que antes de pasar con la primera parte, me gustaría que le explicaras un poco al público qué vamos a ver.
Bueno, lo que vamos a ver hoy es la primera parte. Estuvimos conversando por un poco más de una hora con Mar Polimeropoulos, mi colega, nuestro colega, productor editorial de este programa, José Antonio Évora, y un servidor. Y lo que vamos a ver en la parte de hoy, primero hoy que lo estuvimos revisando, un testimonio excepcional. Quiero decir que Mar Polimeropoulos, además de lo que tú comentaste, que fue jefe del servicio de clandestinaje para Europa y para Asia, su rango en la CIA, que es distinto al ejército y a otra fuerza, él tenía un rango similar a general de 3 estrellas. Así que imagínense el tamaño del personaje. Yo he visto muchas entrevistas que le han hecho a él. Yo te digo, no porque le hicimos nosotros, sino por lo que él revela, es la más completa por las cosas que aborda. Primero rechaza definitivamente el informe, el reporte de la comunidad de inteligencia, que concluye 3 cosas básicamente. Una, que detrás de los extraños fenómenos no se ha encontrado ningún adversario extranjero. Número 2, que no se ha encontrado ningún dispositivo, ningún arma que cause los efectos que ya conocemos. Y número 3, que no lo mencioné el viernes por la premura, que responde a que estos fenómenos se dieron por condiciones preexistentes de salud. Estoy hablando de los afectados. Lo que vamos a ver hoy es completamente revelador y va a tener amplias repercusiones, no solo aquí en nuestra comunidad, sino yo te diría en más de un lugar, empezando por la propia Habana. Es excepcional su testimonio, la valoración con la experiencia que tiene como alto oficial de inteligencia, que eso lo vamos a conversar después, y sin duda lo que él considera que pasó y otras cositas que la gente se va a enterar. Así que una entrevista, yo me siento muy complacido que él haya querido hablar tan ampliamente y tan a profundidad. Y bueno, cuando tú digas arrancamos con la entrevista.
Ya. Así que nada, vamos a ver esta primera parte. Adelante.
Okay. Hello, Mark. Thank you for being with us.
Hola, Mark. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Usted ha tenido que pasar por mucho desde el 2017. ¿Cómo se está sintiendo ahora?
Well, first of all, it's a great honor to be here. I'm feeling much better. Thank you for asking, because it's been an incredible 5-year journey where, you know, when I was first injured, I could barely even, get up in the morning. I couldn't go to work. I had terrible headaches. I had brain fog. I couldn't drive. And now I'm at the point where, I'm feeling much, much better. I still have a headache. I've had a headache every day for 5 years, but it's not a terrible migraine, and so I'm doing better. And, there's I was told by my doctors it would be a marathon to recovery. It's true, but each day I'm improving. So thank you for asking.
Right to the point.
Directo al grano. ¿Cuál es su visión? ¿Cómo califica usted el informe de inteligencia que ha salido acerca del síndrome de La Habana? ¿Qué piensa?
So to me, it was a bit of a punch in the stomach, because something certainly happened to us, and so there's many reported cases around the world, and I'm not saying that every single one of those cases, might be accurate, but the individuals I know who worked for the CIA, who were involved in high-threat operations around the world, primarily against the Russians. Many of them suffered such injuries that they had to retire medically. they're debilitating injuries. They were at the top, physical and mental, game of their lives. They were the tip of the spear for the U.S. government. Really, we're an incredible instrument. That's what the CIA is. And then they had to walk away, and their lives are forever changed. So I think that report was a punch in the gut, because it almost tells us that what happened to us is not real. And to me, that was a sad day. That report. I just don't agree with it. I hope that Congress investigates this, because I just don't think I don't put a lot of credit in the report.
El senador Marco Rubio dijo que no saber lo que pasó no significa que no haya pasado nada.
Right. So Senator Rubio has been an incredible ally to the victims on this. And one of the things that I find most interesting is that there's certain members of Congress, and frankly, they're both on the Democratic side and the Republican side, who I think have a lot of compassion for the victims. And Senator Rubio really is one who does. And so we've all met with him over the years from time to time, but I can tell you that he is absolutely committed to finding out what happened. But more importantly, for me personally, she shows a lot of compassion and care for U.S. government employees we were serving our country. And when something happens to you when you're serving your country, you expect the government to take care of you with health care, with benefits, things that are going to be able to allow you to lead a productive life. And that just hasn't, for a long time, it didn't happen. So again, I give Rubio a lot of credit on this. I'm very thankful to him and his staff.
Can we agree?
¿Estamos de acuerdo en decir que usted fue víctima de un ataque directo? ¿Concuerda usted con nosotros?
I do, the reason why I say this is not just based on what I've read in the media. Some of my friends were in Havana. A good friend of mine was the first U.S. Official who was injured in Havana, and he was, someone, again, before the attack, incredible physical shape, incredible mental shape, and now he walks with a service dog. He's blind in one eye. He has such terrible vertigo, he has to wear a special vest that is weighted. He's young, he's under 40 years old, but his life is forever changed. So I see him with my eyes. I see him with my eyes, and I know something terrible happened to him. And so, and again, having met some of the other victims in Havana as well, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind what happened there was an attack. And I think that the U.S. government owes it to the victims to keep investigating, not to put out a report like they just put out, which essentially says it's nothing.
¿Está dispuesto a creer que no hay un adversario extranjero ni ningún arma detrás de todo esto?
Of course not. I mean, so how does someone like myself, or my colleagues in Havana, or my colleagues in China, in Vietnam where it happened, in Serbia where it happened, these are, when you think of, you would be proud of them if you met them. These are elite of the American intelligence services and top, physical and mental condition, going to do really important work. But when I see how they have been, what has happened to them, of course I believe it's a state actor. Of course I believe it's an adversary who's doing this, because the intelligence officers were the ones who were targeted very specifically. And now there's a lot of question on who is behind this. But when you look at places like Havana, like Moscow, like in China, in Hanoi, Belgrade, there is a common thread here. It's either the Russians or countries friendly to Russia who have carried this out. So look, maybe I'll be proven wrong. Maybe I'm totally incorrect on this. I don't think so.
Do you feel betrayed?
¿Se siente traicionado por este informe, Mark?
Yes. I will tell you why I feel betrayed, because what they were not smart in the report. If they had said simply, we don't know yet. We don't know, and we're going to keep the investigation going. But they were so adamant that there's no foreign adversary, and they were adamant that those of us who suffered injuries, they call it, well, maybe we had pre-existing medical conditions, or maybe there was environmental conditions. They seem to explain away what happened. That's just not possible, because my doctors at Walter Reed, a U.S. military hospital, said the opposite, said, no, actually, Mark did not have pre-existing conditions. I suffered a brain injury. It shows up on images, MRIs and things like that. I don't have any pre-existing conditions. And so I think with that report, if they had just said, we don't know and we're going to continue to investigate, I'd be fine with that. But they seem to be so conclusive. It just that of course then raises a lot of questions in my mind. Why are they being so adamant, so strong in denying this happened? And so that to me was the betrayal.
¿Cuál pudiera ser la razón? ¿Por qué los líderes habrían llegado a esta conclusión? ¿Qué piensa usted al respecto?
What do you think about it?
So I think that there's a need in their mind, and I understand this to some extent. They need to get back to business. So when you have so many people who have been injured, then you have a problem of, well, how are we going to staff? How are we going to send people overseas again to some of these hard locations if they believe that it's unsafe? And so now if they, so I think institutionally they want this to go away because they're going to have trouble staffing the overseas, the embassies.
But nobody believes that.
Pero nadie lo cree. Nosotros no lo creemos.
Even us. Nobody.
Because I think you don't believe it because it was because they didn't say what they should have is just we don't know yet. Just say that.
Yeah.
It's okay. So one of the things I learned as an intelligence officer, when the boss of the CIA would ask me, Mark, what do you think of this? What's your assessment? And if I didn't know, you have to say I don't know. You have to do that. Because I make the joke, an intelligence officer is like a philosopher. We ask questions all the time. Well, someone gives you an answer. Excuse me. Then you say, well, why is that? And then you say again, well, why is that? So you keep peeling that away. And again, it to me is a mistake for them to have been so conclusive in that report. And I think it also opens up the CIA and other places to later on, if they find out it was the Russians or the Cubans or the Chinese or a combination of everyone, they're going to look pretty silly. The credibility of the CIA will be affected. So why don't you leave yourself a little bit of room, analytically? And they didn't do that, though. So I think that was a big mistake.
¿Cómo es posible que le haya pasado a usted y no a los que estaban a su alrededor?
Usted era un pez gordo, una vaca sagrada en inteligencia.
I never thought of myself as
¿Por qué le pasó a usted en Moscú, no en Miami? En ese momento en Moscú usted estaba a cargo del servicio de clandestinaje, de las operaciones para Europa y Asia. ¿Por qué le pasó a usted?
I think it was a target of opportunity. They didn't like me to begin with. They knew who I was. Even when I had applied for a visa to go there was some they were complaining, why do you have to come visit the embassy? And so there is bad blood between the U.S. and the Russian intelligence services, of course, even though we sometimes meet them because we have to keep lines of communication open. But ultimately, I think they saw me as a very convenient target of opportunity on their turf. Yeah. And just like our officials in Havana, so people have this notion. I mean, it's incredible to me that, at the time in Cuba there was a reopening of ties. There was a decision from the Obama administration to reopen ties. But what people don't understand is the war between U.S. and Cuban intelligence was going as hard as ever. Cuban intelligence didn't make the decision that they wanted to have better ties with the United States. So they were a very strong adversary. And so, again, our officials in Havana were sitting ducks there. And I think there were targets of opportunity for the Cubans or elements of the Cuban, regime who were against any kind of rapprochement with America, certainly to take action. I mean, does the Cuban government have the technology to do this alone? Well, perhaps not. My sense is that it was with the Russians together, but it makes some sense considering the history of the Russian presence on the island. And so again, when you're dealing with people like us within the intelligence community, we're smart people. When I see my officers injured in Havana, injured in Moscow, it doesn't take I don't need to have gone, I don't have to be a NASA rocket scientist to figure out who's behind this. I mean, please. And so, and then a lot of things that happened over the years, there was a lot of interviews with Cuban government officials who denied this, who said we didn't do this. Well, I mean, what are they going to say? I'd throw that out. That's nonsense.
No solo tu opinión, sino ¿Cómo sientes?
Mira, primero, pues sé que tenemos que seguir en el programa. Primero, en este segmento que acabamos de ver, él dice 3 cosas muy importantes. Número 1, él rechaza totalmente este reporte de la comunidad de inteligencia de los Estados Unidos que ha dicho esas 3 cosas. Número 1, que no hay ningún adversario detrás de estos fenómenos. Número 2, que no hay ningún arma, ningún dispositivo encontrado. De hecho, yo sé que en las investigaciones que se hicieron, o casualidad, en las computadoras, los teléfonos celulares, etcétera, de varios de estos oficiales que fueron afectados, no hallaron rastro de ninguna huella, no hallaron de que alguien haya penetrado, cosa curiosa. Y número 3, para mí, en este segmento, Mark Polimeropoulos, un alto ex jefe de la CIA, general de 3 estrellas, ha rechazado no solo el informe, sino dice que se siente traicionado. Y número 3, lo último que dice es, él no cree, es imposible que no haya ningún adversario. Y él apunta directamente a los servicios de espionaje rusos ligados a los cubanos y probablemente a los chinos, etcétera, que le demuestren lo contrario. En los próximos segmentos vamos a ver mucho más que él amplía y él da su hipótesis de qué pudo haber pasado, que a mí en 2 puntos me sorprende muchísimo.
A ver, resumiendo brevemente, yo apunté que no pudo conducir por los daños durante un tiempo, que estuvo 5 años con dolores de cabeza. El amigo que con apenas 40 años de edad ha quedado ciego de un ojo, que necesita plomos para caminar, para balancearse, y que es un actor estatal el que está detrás de todo.
Un gobierno, lo que quiere decir es un gobierno.
Vamos a una pausa, regresamos con más de esta entrevista porque todavía hay mucho que revelar. Bueno, continuamos con este testimonio excepcional de Mark Polimeropoulos sobre el síndrome de La Habana. ¿Qué vamos a ver en esta segunda parte?
Lo que vamos a ver en esta segunda parte es su hipótesis de qué pudo haber pasado y sobre todo el tema del famoso dispositivo, lo que él cree por su experiencia y nos da un ángulo revelador que yo no había pensado tanto tiempo que uno lleva siguiendo este asunto y es muy interesante porque contradice completamente los argumentos que ha dado el gobierno cubano, ya no te diría los rusos.
Y empieza con una pregunta tuya sobre si cuando él fue a Moscú sabía lo que había estado pasando en La Habana.
En La Habana, correcto.
Adelante.
Cuando usted viaja a Moscú en el 2017, ¿estaban al tanto de lo que había pasado en La Habana con sus colegas y sus amigos?
Wasn't even thinking of it. That's the thing too. So I wasn't even thinking of it. And that's important to note because some of the people, the Cuban government especially, puts forward the notion that this was, they call it psychogenic. It's mass psychosis. But how is it, if I'm going to Moscow, essentially a routine trip, it's not operational. I was the equivalent of a 3-star general. I was going there to, as a senior officer. I'm not worried about the trip. I'm not nervous about the trip. I'm certainly not thinking about what happened to my colleagues the year before in Havana, which disputes the whole notion that this was some kind of mass psychosis. So again, and looking back, just knowing the cases in Havana as well, what was interesting about Havana is it was happening to different U.S. government officials there, but they weren't telling each other about it. So there was no mass psychosis there as well. So those claims that the Cubans or others make that somehow we're all kind of crazy and have all kind of suffered from this psychogenic effect, that just doesn't fly at all. Again, that's what people use to try to explain this, but to me that is there. And when you talk to doctors, there's no medical basis for this at all.
¿Cuál es su hipótesis? ¿Quién está detrás de esto? ¿Qué desean lograr? ¿Recolectar información?
Great question. Yeah.
Usted es un experto. ¿Qué piensa? Usted es un pez gordo. ¿Qué se pretendía con esto?
I'm going to use what we say all the time in the intelligence community. It depends. So here's what I think. Obviously, I think there is technology, this directed energy technology that can be used, for signals intelligence collection. Exactly what you're saying. Collect info from your cell phone. Maybe they're trying to listen into discussions in a room, for example. But so it is possible that's how this started. But I think what the Cubans and the Russians probably, in my view, eventually learned is this also could be used as a weapon. So perhaps it evolved. Perhaps in Havana, for example, they when they did this the first couple times, they were trying to collect information, cell phone discussions, verbal discussions, but then they see it injures some U.S. officials, and they said, well, wait a second, maybe we can use this as a weapon. And why this is and I hate to say this because it happened to me, but why this is a brilliant weapon is it's what we call non-attributable. Nobody can find out about it. It's hard to detect. Yeah. And what it does is it's not shooting someone with a pistol. It's not assaulting them on the street. It's doing something, and what it's doing is they're removing American intelligence officers from the battlefield, which is exactly what the Cuban intelligence service wanted. Do you think they wanted American intelligence officers in Havana? No, absolutely not. No. Exactly what the Russians want. So it's taking us off the battlefield in a kind of, in a manner in which it's hard to detect. It actually is a perfect weapon, if you think about it that way. And so that's my sense, that perhaps it started off as a signals collection tool. They saw what it was doing to people, and then they weaponized it. And that's my theory. I have no evidence on this other than I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I throw in the last piece is that the idea that this technology doesn't exist is ridiculous. The U.S. government, by the way, has this. The Russian government has this. If you look in the open source world, there's directed energy weapons that people use for riot control, for example. And the Department of Defense, we've been testing this stuff, and we look back on the open source on the internet. The Russians have been too. So this technology exists. This is not some kind of super secret James Bond type affair. The reason why it was never used against people because it's unethical, it's immoral. Look what's happening to us. So there's an ethical reason not to do it, and I think, probably the Cubans and the Russians, obviously not known to be the most ethical and moral of regimes, decided to weaponize it.
Y una vez que se dieron cuenta de que era un arma, por supuesto quisieron que el resto de la comunidad de inteligencia se asustara con esto.
Right? Exactly. And look what happened. And it worked. Yes. If you think about it, when we always talk about, one of what we call covert action. The Russians call it active measures. But if you think about it, again, I hate to say this, I don't want to give them credit, but it's a campaign that worked. And it did cause a lot of fear in the U.S. government and continues to do so now. So I would almost say that it has all the earmarks. I mean, it really does. It looks exactly like what an active measures campaign, a successful one, would do. It strikes fear in your opponent. It removes people from their work. It distracts. It's caused us all sorts of controversy within the U.S. government. Even what we're talking about today, they would consider a success. And so, it's one of those things that I think is going to go down in intelligence history. Unfortunately, is probably something that was successful for our adversaries.
Tengo una curiosidad. Después de la invasión rusa a Ucrania, el director de la CIA, William Burns, fue a Moscú antes de la invasión y habló con Sergei Naryshkin, Nikolai Patrushev y hasta con Vladimir Putin. Y estos episodios desaparecieron.
So my understanding is he did raise this issue with them. And I think you make a good point. Now, I don't have all the data. I'm not in the government anymore. But it seems to me that after the invasion, a lot of these incidents, certainly the number of them went down pretty dramatically. So what does that tell you? If they're not happening anymore, and we think that the Russians were the ones who were doing it, again, I didn't get my business degree at Harvard, but I'm still a pretty smart kid. Even I'm a middle class kid from New Jersey. But ultimately, I think a lot of the incidents did go down after the Russian invasion, which leads you again to suspicion that perhaps the Russians are behind it.
Usted dijo una vez que prefería haber recibido un disparo.
Yeah.
¿Por qué dijo eso?
So if you look right behind me, there's a picture on my wall. It was painted by one of the victims, and it's a black canvas with a red splotch of paint. And we called that the gunshot, and that was the notion that we always wished we had been shot, because then people would have believed us. You have a bullet wound. Now, in some sense, we do have that with with our doctors and the doctors' reports. But I'll tell you, a lot more people would have believed us. We would have gotten medical treatment right away. If there was a gunshot, if there was a wound, I could say, look, I'm shot, I'm bleeding, I need care. No one would dispute that. And so that's why we say that all the time. And I still, to this day, feel that way. That because this is when you have a brain injury, what does that mean? It means it's silent. Nobody can see it. There's days I'm feeling okay today, but and I'm feeling much better. But some days you have a terrible headache. Some days you have what we call brain fog, or you forget things a bit. I'm gonna sound like my old Greek grandmother when I say this, but sometimes weather issues affect the way I feel. I'm joking because my Greek grandmother would say, you got sick because of the weather. Well, for a lot of us with traumatic brain injury, barometric pressure drops affect the way your head feels. And so but again, it's this notion of a silent injury, a silent wound, an unseen injury, which is very, very frustrating. And that's why we say, we wish we had been shot.
Sí, no es un arma de guerra clásica, es el arma que cualquier asesino que no quiere dejar huella utilizaría. Medidas activas, por cierto, es el mismo término que usa la inteligencia.
El aparato cubano, correcto. Pero fíjate, hay algo que él aporta que yo no había reparado en ello. Primero, uno piensa, bueno, estos dispositivos son para la recolección de información a través de las señales electromagnéticas, etcétera. Número dos, él dice que pueden ser usadas como armas para el control de motines, etcétera. Tienen muchas aplicaciones. Pero número tres, él apunta que al ser una operación exitosa en el que remueven, ellos logran quitar del campo, del field, operativos de inteligencia de los Estados Unidos, sea en Moscú, sea en La Habana, sea en Londres, sea donde sea, en Viena, por ejemplo, que fue un teatro importante donde esto ocurrió. Una vez que eso sucede, primero logra crear una confusión, un pánico dentro de la administración, sea demócrata o republicana, dentro del gobierno de los Estados Unidos y dentro de la inteligencia, dentro de la comunidad de inteligencia de los Estados Unidos. Y en ese momento, eso se convierte en una campaña mucho más exitosa aún. Es decir, uno no lo había visto de esa manera, pero diciéndolo un hombre del tamaño de Mar Polimeropoulos, uno se espanta si esta campaña fue exitosa y se ha detenido. No hay casos reportados, o si acaso muy pocos, después de la invasión del 24
porque los rusos están ocupados en otra cosa.
O no sé. El viaje de William Burns, el director de la CIA, que lo comentamos en esta mesa, a Moscú, donde habla con Sergei Narinsky, que es el jefe de los servicios de espionaje exteriores rusos, y habla con un hombre que acaba de estar en La Habana, Nikolai Patrushev, el consejero de Seguridad Nacional de Putin, y habla por teléfono con el propio Vladimir Putin. Yo no creo que solo hablaron de Ucrania antes de la invasión. Yo creo que esto tuvo que haber habido una fuerte advertencia de Estados Unidos hacia Moscú, porque ¿cómo tú combates eso? ¿Cuál es tu respuesta como potencia?
Bueno, pero él dice una cosa, todos los involucrados tienen un denominador común, son aliados de Moscú. Y a Cuba se le intenta tratar como si no lo fuera. Regresamos con más, porque hay más.
Usted tuvo que jubilarse en el 2019 cuando tenía el tanque lleno, como usted mismo dijo, y tenía dolores de cabeza diarios. ¿La pesadilla comenzó entonces o ya usted la estaba viviendo antes?
Great question. So one of the things is, when I came back from Moscow in 2017, I was begging the agency, begging CIA, to send me to the University of Pennsylvania, which at time was treating the victims from Havana, and the CIA medical officers said no. They refused to send me to the University of Pennsylvania. And that was a big fight I had with them. And then my condition deteriorated so much I could only go to work about 2 or 3 hours a day. And so then I ended up retiring in 2019. And even after retirement, when the CIA started sending officers to Walter Reed's traumatic brain injury clinic. Walter Reed is the Department of Defense's preeminent, most prestigious hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. And some of my colleagues from Havana and from elsewhere were getting treatment there, and they were having some success, but they still refused my requests. It was terrible. And so what I did, which was a very unusual step, is I went public with it. I was desperate. So I talked to a reporter, and she wrote a story about me, which then exploded all over the world, because what I was saying is I was begging for health care. And immediately after that, the agency was embarrassed. 3 former CIA directors called me and said, what's going on? And then they called CIA and they reversed their position, and I get to Walter Reed. But by the time I got to Walter Reed in, we're talking 2021, I was in terrible shape for 2 reasons. One is, just physically, I had blinding headaches again. I couldn't work for more than 2 or 3 hours a day. But also the whole process of my going public, which is very unusual for someone who worked for 26 years in the shadows. And my fight with CIA caused a lot of kind of mental health issues for me too, because a lot of I felt betrayed by a lot of my former colleagues who were angry at me for going public. Not everybody, but some of them were. And so, it was only, I will tell you, until the new CIA director, Bill Burns, took power, and I knew him from a previous overseas posting, that things changed. I got to Walter Reed, and he showed a lot of compassion, and I was brought a little bit back more into the old CIA family, but it was a really tough road, and so it was both these physical injuries, but also kind of on the mental health side. So when you said the hell started, well, it certainly started in December of 2017, but I had a pretty public fight with CIA about this until finally I get to Walter Reed. And let me tell you one more piece that's really important, and I haven't talked about this in public at all, is that Congress passed and President Biden signed what's called the Havana Act. And that provides compensation for victims. And I received that. So just recently, I actually received a settlement from them. And to me, that was a pretty incredible moment, because I'm not going to sit here and gloat or smile, but I won my case. I proved that I had a brain injury, suffered in the line of duty. And so that to me was kind of the final piece of my health journey. And so it's been a terrible ride. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. I will tell you that. It's I battled Al Qaeda and the Taliban and terrorist groups my whole career in counterterrorism. Made a lot of enemies along the way. But I wouldn't wish this what I've gone through even on my worst enemy. It's been a terrible 5 years. But again, I'm feeling better. There's hope for the future, but it's been a long road.
Pero usted quiere saber lo que pasó.
To know what happened.
Yeah.
¿Sigue usted tratando de averiguar lo que pasó? ¿Están investigando usted y sus amigos, las víctimas? ¿Qué piensa al respecto? Hasta hoy el Pentágono no se ha dado por vencido.
Today, the Pentagon doesn't giving up on this matter.
Well, you make a great point. And so, of course, I put the whole issue of Havana syndrome into kind of 3 categories. One is accountability of how we were treated in the past. And the CIA, to its credit, did, in essence, tear down the old medical office. They changed everything because they treated us so badly. Number 2 is healthcare, and they've gotten better. Again, I was compensated. I received the Havana Act compensation. But the last piece, which I call attribution, where you're talking about what happened, that's the remaining mystery. And I don't think CIA has proven itself capable in investigating this. I think the investigation is moving to the Department of Defense, where it should be, in terms of resources, in terms of personnel, but also not being biased, not having any agenda. And what you're referring to there is some articles in Politico over the last couple of days, which shows not only that as DOD taken over the investigation, they've been involved in a lot of research and development testing. This article I think that you're talking about is they have funding to do testing on animals to see what is an animal who is subject to microwave radiation, what does their brain look like compared to mine. That's really important, because again, we're going to find what caused this, and then of course the next step is how to treat it. So I'm very thankful to the Department of Defense for this. I think it's the right place to go, and I think there's support in Congress for this from Senator Rubio and others. They will push funding to Department of Defense. Everything needs to be funded, so that's important. And ultimately, I think we're going to get to the bottom of this one day. But the fact that it's with DOD now is a very important piece in solving this.
¿Por qué cree usted que fue en La Habana y no en otro lugar?
In Havana, not in other places.
There's lots of different theories on this. I mean, I think that, in my view, and again, this is not based on evidence that I have, it's just my opinion, is that there were probably elements of the Cuban security services that did not want good ties with the United States. And I don't know if it's the Cuban government as a whole, but certainly elements of this Cuban intelligence who worked with Russia on this to hurt our officials. That's my sense. And so I think that it started in Havana because you had an environment which the Cuban government controlled totally. It's a police state, as you all know. American officials are very vulnerable. There's nothing that an American can do. They can't pick up a phone, walk around their house, go down the street, or talk to anyone, any Cuban citizen without the Cuban intelligence seeing it. So they had control. So they would be able to predict where any U.S. Official would be. But I think that it makes some sense to me that they would do this in order to promote their own agenda, with the Cuban intelligence services. That's just my opinion. I don't, because, but again, it goes back to the fact of if you talk to people at that time, and I think there was a lot of, clearly there was a lot of publicity about a warming of ties between the U.S. and Cuba. But those of us on the inside who really know about Cuban intelligence, there was no warming of ties whatsoever. And so a lot of that was a lot of a charade, I think, for public consumption, because there are still really strong elements within Cuba that were really dedicated to the communist government, saw the United States as absolute enemies, and were not ready for any kind of war. And so I think there is some it makes some sense to me that they would try to torpedo kind of American engagement on the island. But that's my 2 cents. People have differing opinions on this. I certainly don't believe the Cuban government denials that they had nothing to do with this. It doesn't happen on Cuban soil without either their active participation or letting the Russians come in.
Yeah.
And I can't even fathom that. Anyone who knows Cuba understands that they would have to have some knowledge.
¿Cómo pudieran los líderes de la comunidad de inteligencia explicar que el paciente cero, quien usted conoce muy bien, fue un oficial de inteligencia encubierto trabajando en La Habana en el 2016? ¿Cómo puede explicarse eso?
Could they explain that?
Well, so that's why this, it's frustrating when you see U.S. government intelligence community officials now say we don't have an adversary who did this, but we acknowledge Americans have been hurt. So what is it? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And again, we're not talking about Americans who are sitting at the U.S. Embassy in London, or in Athens, or in Berlin.
Or in Vienna.
Or in Vienna. There are cases there, and then those cases make some sense because there's some Russian presence there. But we're talking about Havana, and so and the other point of this too is there are multiple officials in Havana who have really suffered traumatic injuries, and so the idea that we would somehow think that a state actor was not involved, you can't explain that conclusion. Now, what I would understand if they said we don't know. We just don't know. That's okay. To me, that's okay. That's an honest assessment from a smart intelligence officer. The last piece I'll say on this is when you look at a place like Havana, and frankly, there is at the time it was a very small U.S. embassy, very small U.S. government presence. We actually don't, and the security services are all over us there. The notion that somehow we have the ability to tell what's going on inside there is just not accurate. We call it a denied area. What does that mean? It means we don't, it's hard for a U.S. official to move around. It's hard for us to collect information. So, when the U.S. government says we definitely know that the Cubans were not involved or the Russians were not involved, well, how? We don't have the ability, we don't have the insight on what goes on inside of Havana. To make that assessment. You see where I'm coming from on this?
Absolutely.
And so, it's not like New York City or Miami or Pittsburgh, in an open society, it's a place where we actually don't have a lot of understanding. And so, again, I would have preferred if they said we just don't know. But to discount the state actor piece, I don't understand how they can do that.
That was your last.
Ese ha sido su último comentario sobre este tema y ha ido directo al grano.
Very straight to the point.
En el 2020, la Academia Nacional de Ciencia, Ingeniería y Medicina halló que la causa más probable del síndrome de La Habana fue energía de pulsaciones dirigidas de frecuencia. ¿Cuál versión usted cree que sea la correcta? ¿La de la Academia Nacional o la evaluación del Consejo de Inteligencia Nacional?
This is such a good question because, what I found at the end of the day is I listen to my doctors. I listen to scientists. I listen to experts. I have respect for the intelligence community, of course, but what you are citing right now, the National Academy of Sciences report, these are experts in the field of medicine and science. And they said the most plausible cause of injury for us was directed energy weapon. That to me is really important because what are they looking at? They're looking at, medical records. They're looking at our brain. They're looking at this testing we talked about with the Department of Defense. How we went from that report to then what was just released last week is a mystery to me. How does that make sense? And I also know that some of the officials on that who wrote that in the National Academy of Sciences report were kicked off the panel afterwards. I think probably because it was inconvenient for the government to hear what they had to say. But again, I listen to scientists and I listen to doctors, and that to me is the most important part of it. But I think what you're showing is a level of dysfunction in the U.S. government. And so, people always ask me, they said, why is this so controversial? And at first I would say, my answer was, is it a conspiracy? And I would say, well, probably not. Usually things like this are based on incompetence. People make mistakes, but I've changed my tune on this because I think it's government dysfunction. So you have different sides of the U.S. government saying different things. So that the National Academy of Sciences report, really important. But now there's this National Intelligence Council report that seems to refute that. Yet, then you have the Department of Defense just the other day saying, no, we believe it, we're moving forward full speed. So what is it? What is it? There's no whole of government approach. No one is speaking together, which is why I think it would have been better in this intelligence report to have just said, we don't know yet.
¿Existe una agenda política?
I mean, the political agenda to me is much more of the sense of this is too hard to deal with if it's true. So what if we assess that let's say it's the Cubans, the Russians, the Chinese, all three, one of the three, two of the three, actually did this. So here's the problem. What is the policy option there? Because I always say that if we do catch who has done this, it's an act of war against Americans. And you have to have an appropriate response. Well, what does that mean? So it's almost easier for there not to be that conclusion, because if there was a conclusion, how do you hold the Cuban government or the Russian government or the Chinese government, responsible? And that's a policy decision that is very difficult because there's Americans who are critically injured. And so to me, it's not necessarily a political agenda in favor of one country or another. It's far easier not to solve this. And I think that's a mistake.